So first things first, I'm going to be using lard, and I don't usually use lard in my recipes just because it's not the most popular thing to use nowadays for pie crusts, but it is the gold standard. So if you can find lard, then you probably should. And this is hydrogenated lard, so it's not exactly the most old-fashioned type of lard. What that does is it reduces the amount of trans fats. In fact, in this case, I think to 0, which makes it slightly more healthy for you than the old stuff. Meat pie. Meat pie is synonymous with British heritage, and I would be lying if I said that it was particularly popular in the United States. And today I'm going to be making a meat pie that is very special to me and to Lawrence because we used to eat them all the time when we were dating. But even more importantly, this is a pie that you honestly just won't find in shelves anywhere in the United States unless you are lucky enough to be close to some kind of purveyor of British goods. So I'm going to teach you how to make your own because not only is it one of my favorite things in the world to make, but meat pies take me all the way back to when I was starting to learn to cook as a college student for the first time. Stay tuned while we make the most British of meat pies, arguably at least, the pork pie. You can find all of the ingredients and their proper amounts on oldfashionedaf.com, so I suggest that you check there if you want to try this recipe for yourself. Now, I will warn you, I almost didn't put this recipe on the website because this is a very labor-intensive recipe, but it is also one of my favorites of all time, so I figured for you, I would make an exception. Now, if you are just that ambitious that you try this recipe for yourself, I certainly want to know. So you can use the hashtag #CraftyVintageLady on any social platform, and I will love to see what you've come up with. All right, in goes the water, in goes the milk. And what we're going to do is we're going to wait for the lard to melt into the water and milk mixture. Pie is traditionally a pie that is filled with pork, and the crust is called a hot water crust. And what that means is that it's a standing crust. Now, you might recall that recently Townsend's did a video about standing crusts, also called coffins sometimes. Well, when I worked in living history, that was one of the first things that I learned to make was a standing crust, because they did, once upon a time, get featured in American cookbooks, but they're much older than that. In the meantime, what separates a standing crust from your regular run-of-the-mill pie crust isn't really the ingredients as much as it is the method. So the way that you make a hot water crust is by melting down all of the wet ingredients and then adding them to the dry ingredients so that a reaction causes the pie crust to be a little bit more moldable. pies were actually pretty popular in colonial America. The popularity of meat pies in the United States only just started to wane in the 20th century. Specifically with those of European heritage, meat pies were mainstays in any cookbook that you might own throughout your life. While we think of meat pies specifically as being British, there is an entire European history that was brought over and continued on in the form of American meat pies, but not necessarily with the pork pie. The pork pie is uniquely British. The standing crust or coffin was a fixture of medieval fare because it was used as a method of preserving meat for months on end. And so what you would do is you would take the standing crust, which of course you formed like you just saw, and then you would put whatever meat you wanted to inside of it, and then cap the crust, crimp it, put a little hole in the top, bake the pie, and then put a little bit of gelatin on the inside in the hole, and cook the whole pie inside the coals of an open flame, rendering the pie crust pretty unpalatable, and so nobody would really eat that. Instead, after preserving that meat that way, what they would do is they would take the meat out and then they would use the meat in other dishes or eat it on its own. It wasn't until the 19th century that the standing pie crust got a glow up, and it became a lot more palatable because cooks started baking the pies instead of putting them in coals to preserve the meat. While the gelatin was still very much a fixture, they reserved that gelatin specifically for the pork pie because the flavor of the gelatin with the pork is actually really lush. You also have a story that circulated in the 19th century that regarded pork pies as basically a picnic fare for the upper classes. And despite what some historians believe, I personally think that that's probably true because a pork pie is actually very delicious. It can be kept cold, and in fact it's supposed to be eaten cold, but also in cooks' memoirs and instruction manuals for cooks in stately homes, there are a number of different examples of recipes for pork and meat pies that were meant to be eaten cold while you were out on a picnic or on the hunt. And so I think that there can be no doubt that pork pies have a universal quality that made it suitable picnic fare for upper and lower classes alike, but upper classes were able to get those choice cuts of meat, and the cooks who had advanced knowledge of how to prepare things like standing crusts, making these pies very accessible for anyone who was going out on a picnic. Which brings me to present day and Melton Mowbray pork pies. Melton Mowbray pork pies have protected status. Protective status is a fancy European way of saying this specific type of food only can be called this specific type of thing if it's from this specific place. So champagne, for example, has protected status, and if it were up to me, then apple cider donuts would have protected status in New England. But of course, we don't have protected status in the United States. Because Melton Mowbray pork pies have protected status, I can't technically call this a Melton Mowbray pork pie recipe, but it basically is. What separates Melton Mowbray pork pies from other meat pies is that addition of the gelatin on top. Now that sounds really disgusting if you're an American, I'm almost certain of it, or it makes you think of aspics or other gelatin weird flavored things. But I assure you, this gelatin only enhances the flavor of the pie itself. And without the gelatin, which I have made pork pies without the gelatin in the past, it's just not the same and it's not nearly as good. So I definitely suggest that even though the gelatin is technically optional, that you try your very best to include it because it is just not the same pie without it. So these are supposed to be cold. They've been in the refrigerator overnight, and now we're going to try them. Now, ideally, what you want in a good pork pie is the crust to be full, and you want a layer of meat that is shrunk just a little bit so that there is some room at the top for the gelatin. And then of course, each pie has a hole that you put the gelatin in. So there is a thin layer of gelatin all around the top and the sides. and that is what makes this specifically a Melton Mowbray pork pie. Of course, not really. And traditionally, you will pair it with something called piccalilli. Piccalilli is pickled vegetables, usually a mixture of cauliflower, sometimes carrots, usually cucumber, and onions and green beans. It becomes a bright orange color as it pickles because turmeric is something that is inside the vinegar mixture as you make the pickles. But today, I have paired our pork pies with lots of beautiful fresh vegetables because it is basically harvest season. So all of these vegetables, of course, would have just come out of our garden if we had one. We don't this year, unfortunately, since we just moved. Maybe next year. Either way, lots of delectable vegetables for us to palate cleanse with. You're waiting with trepidation, right?
I am. Can we just get to the bit where I eat them?
Ready?
Yes. Can I just eat the whole one there instead of little segments?
If you want to be a heathen.
That's not heathen. That children in Britain are born eating pork pies.
So chin chin, as the British people say.
Well, that's when you're drinking beer. It's different, but equally bad for you. So let's have a go. There's definitely no dignified way of eating this on camera, but it is amazing. You've done a fantastic job. If this was my show, I'd give this 7.5 Lorenzos out of 5.
Wow. So what are the flavors that come out for you?
Pork, obviously.
I feel like a lot of people want to overcomplicate pork pies. I've seen lots of recipes where they'll put a whole bunch of spices in the pork mixture. But for me, what makes a really good pork pie is when you really let the pork sing. When the pork flavor is what comes out before anything else.
It is singing, and I think it's singing with high notes, falsetto pork.
If you ever want to do any kind of spicing to a pork pie at all, I suggest that you put it in the gelatin, however you choose to make your gelatin. Now, in this case, I literally just used a packet of gelatin, and then I put the herbs inside the gelatin, and then mixed it all with the water. So the gelatin is what's spiced in this as opposed to the pork itself. And I think that again, is really crucial for a good pork pie because you don't want to spice the meat too much.
Can we keep eating?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let's take another bite.
Yeah. I'm in heaven.
So now talk to me a little bit about this crust.
What I'd say is it's quite crusty and good. It is absent a soggy bottom, and if particularly with a pork pie, if it is rather soggy on the posterior, then it's going to fall to pieces.
This one is actually a perfect pork pie in that it did not leak at all. But yours, on the other hand, I think you can see with standing crusts specifically, they have a tendency to crack and they have a tendency to have holes in them. Because of that, it is crucial that you refrigerate these right after you put the gelatin in. Otherwise, all of the gelatin will escape, which means that they won't have, done their initial duty, which is to keep the pork inside nice and fresh. Because these are technically picnic food, pair them with fresh vegetables and other finger foods. So I think that is what we're going to do now.
Yeah, I'll probably eat mine off camera later on.
I hope that you try this recipe for my version of the Melton Mowbray pork pie, because I'm telling you, even though it takes like 3 days to make in its full form, it is, in my opinion, one of the best types of meat pie that there is. It just is.
It's the only meat pie. Apart from steak and kidney, that's solid too.
Neither of those are true. There are lots of different types of meat pies, but this one is definitely the one that I prefer.
Chicken pie.
Pretty much any meat can be made into a pie. If you would like to see a steady stream of old-fashioned AF videos, then hit the subscribe button down below. And in the meantime, what should I say if it's not chin chin?
Down the hatch, that's also beer.
Bon appetit.